It is critical for us authors to remember to ask not what your bookstore can do for you, but ask what you and your book can do for your bookstore. This episode is a segment of a chapter from my forthcoming book, A Book in Hand.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 405 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Today's episode is going to be another solo episode. This is as I am working on my book, A Book in Hand. I'm doing some proofreading and trying to get through the manuscript, cleaning it up, tidying up, and finishing off a few extra chapters. I thought I would take advantage of that time and, kind of double down on reusing my time wisely, because I did run out of time with so many things going on. I thought I would share a segment of a very important chapter that's going to be in the book that's coming out in the next month or two. And this chapter is called Ask Not What Your Bookstore Can Do for You. And I thought it would be important to share with you, the listener, because it's going to bring you some backstory, some of the business of what a bookstore is, as well as give you some insights into my own history as a bookseller. So you get a chance to hear a portion of this book prior to the book's release. And that is coming up after this message from this episode's sponsor. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Superstars Writing Seminars. You can check out Superstars Writing at superstarswriting.com. The mission of Superstars Writing Seminars is to empower writers, ignite creativity, and guide individuals on the transformative journey to becoming successful authors. Since their inception in 2010, Superstars has been on a mission to redefine writing conferences, offering more than just workshops. They're on a quest to shape careers and transform dreams into tangible success stories. Now, I've been a guest speaker at Superstars Writing Seminar since 2012, and it's one I look forward to so much every year, not just because I'm heavily involved. I sit on many panels, do several presentations, and am the conference's MC. But this is a definitive conference because it's mostly about helping empower writers with teaching them the business of writing and publishing. There is an additional skills and craft day, and there are a lot of things related to the craft of writing, but it was the very first seminar to focus on helping authors understand the business. And the thing I love about this conference is it teaches you about the business on the traditional publishing side as well as on the self-publishing side. Now, in addition to the regular lineup of speakers and presenters and founders, etc., Kevin J. Anderson, Rebecca Mesta, James Owen, returning speakers Jim Butcher, Jonathan Maybury, and so many other members, we have confirmed for Superstars 2026. We've confirmed Joe Lansdale, Johnny B. Truant, and Maddie Dalrymple. And those are just among the many great writers and speakers and industry people who are going to be there sharing their insights and wisdom. And because it's a smaller conference, it's basically less than 400 people at this conference, there's a really great opportunity to interact and network. And it's at it's a beautiful resort, the Cheyenne Mountain Resort in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And it takes place in early February, of 2026. If you're interested in this, you can go to superstarswriting.com, and if you use the code STARK100, that's STARK 100, you can get $100 off your registration. Again, that is superstarswriting.com, happening in February 2026. Ask not what your library or bookstore can do for you. It's so critical for us authors to remember the importance of stepping outside our own perspective before we approach a library or bookstore with our book. Yes, our book is our baby, that special and beautiful thing that will entertain, inspire, delight, and amuse the right reader. If only we get the chance to get it in front of the reading audience. Bookstores and libraries offer us that opportunity. But let's take a moment to look at it not from our author perspective, but from the perspective of the bookseller or the librarian. It requires, to readapt that old John F. Kennedy quote, for us to ask not what your library or bookstore can do for you, but ask what you can do for your library or bookstore. Let's first break it down into the two main venues and their business models. And from there, understand how you and your book can play an important role in assisting that operation with its unique definition of success. The bookstore. A bookstore is a retail business. Yes, it's a delightful place filled with books. But at its core, it's a location where consumable products are curated, take up physical shelf space, and are available for purchase by consumers. Yes, I know that books are more than simple widgets, and yes, I get that there's more than a simple transaction involved in their sale. Intellectual introspection and emotion are often involved in those transactions. But we'll get to that in a different part of this book. Right now, let's focus on the logistical operation. There is a retail space that someone must pay for. This includes a combination of fixed and variable costs, such as rent, utilities, supply, and labor. All of these costs, or expenses, need to be covered by the sale of the items that are brought into the store's very limited retail storage space, and are displayed in a way that is appealing to the consumers who patronize that store. Because of the unique factor of returns that exists in the book industry, something that virtually no other retailer has as an option, if a book does not sell, the bookseller can return it to that publisher for a full credit or refund. This means that even in the specialized curation that a bookseller does in trying to bring the right book into their store at the right time for the right consumers who cross over their threshold at the right time, there's always the option for them to return that book and replace it with something else that they believe might sell. That practice might seem cold, particularly to a writer. I mean, after all, how could someone turn their back on a product that an author put so much of their personal blood, sweat, and tears into? It's simple. As much as the bookstore owners and staff love and appreciate books, it's the most common reason why a person gets into that line of work after all. They have a business to run. A business they need to work hard at to turn a profit and remain in operation. In a nutshell, they need to make decisions that lead to increasing their sales and the margin that helps them pay for all the costs involved in running that business. They can't just be a showcase where people can come in and look at books and admire their existence without buying them. They're not a museum. They are, at their core, a retail operation. And retail operations require sales transactions to not only stay alive, but to thrive. When I was managing bookstores, in the training of my staff, I used to remind them of one of the ways that booksellers are forced to look at books. Think of this bookstore as an apartment building, I would say. And these books are tenants occupying the limited number of apartments that are available for rent. This would, of course, be after I explained the idea of turning inventory stock. It is based on the ratio between the total inventory value and the items sold. To use a specific example, let's say that the stock of the inventory in your store has a retail value of $100,000, and in a fiscal year, you sell $50,000 of that stock. This means that you would have a turn rate of 0.5. If you sell $100,000 in a single year, you have a turn rate of 1%. This means you turn your inventory completely in a single year. If your stock value is $100,000 and you sell $200,000 in a given year, then that turn rate is 2%. It's typical for the average bookstore that remains operational to turn their inventory anywhere from 2 to 4 times a year. There are, of course, numerous other factors, costs, and considerations involved in a successful bookstore operation, but let's just keep it simple for the purposes of this understanding. So, back to my new bookseller training analogy. After suggesting that they think about the books on the shelves as tenants, I'd remind them that good tenants are the ones who pay for their accommodation by selling and contributing to the turning of the stock 2 to 4 times per year. But what do you do with those books that sit on the shelf for 6 months or longer, not having turned a single time in that period? That's where I have to consider returning that book to the publisher for a credit, which feeds back into my cash flow and allows me to replace it with one that I believe can earn its place on our shelves. It sounds cold, but it is the stark reality that a store that wants to stay in business faces on a regular basis. Yes, there are considerations regarding the cost involved in returning that stock compared with the idea of marking that unsold stock down and blowing it out the way other retailers work. But most bookstores don't operate that way. There are long-standing defined processes by which they simply pull the stock from the retail space, return it to the publisher, and replace it with new stock. This process of returns makes the bookstore very much a consignment-style business. This is not all that different than the consignment process by which a bookstore might procure stock from a local author directly, rather than via a distributor or publisher warehouse. But we'll explore consignment in a separate chapter. What this means to you as an author is that your book is in competition with the other books on those shelves. And for the record, yes, I'm aware that in general, in the author community, it's not a competition and that a rising tide lifts all boats. But if you will allow me the grace of adapting yet another popular saying, let me put it this way. A limited retail space is like a set of locks where the rising water lifts only those boats who get into those curated waters. Of course, it's more complex than that, because just being on the shelves isn't enough. Within the industry, the average returns rates of books back to publishers is anywhere from 20% to 30%. But within some categories or titles, that rate can be as high as 80%. I remember tracking this at the last physical bookstore I managed back in 2010 after a vigorous filtering process of which books actually made it onto the bookstore shelves. To give you an idea of the process, here is a simplified example of the way a book gets into the store via the traditional sales distribution model. A manuscript finally makes its way through thousands upon thousands of slush pile submissions to consideration for publication. For larger publishers, this might involve half a dozen different acquisition editors, each bringing their top 5 titles into a fray where there are 30 titles being considered for the 10 open slots within that publisher's budget for that imprint for a given sales season. Even at that phase, a book being championed by an acquisition editor might not make it all the way. Once a title makes it through that additional internal elimination process, there's another battle royale that takes place with the marketing department. That's where the publisher decides where in the catalog they print for that season the book in question will appear. For example, will it be featured on the cover or prominently within a full-page splash? Or will it be one of hundreds of thumbnails for that season's new releases? The sales rep who visits the bookstore usually has anywhere from half an hour to an hour to go through that catalog, plus perhaps a dozen other catalogs for the publishers/imprints they represent to pitch/present to the bookstore manager/owner/buyer. At this meeting, the sales rep does not want to go through the entirety of any of the catalogs. They usually circle, highlight, or talk about perhaps a dozen of these 100 or more new titles in each catalog. Now, this is based on their own research into comp titles that have either sold either in that store, that region, or in similar stores or in other parts of the country. So at this point of the 500, for example, titles that this publisher has produced under their various imprints for the upcoming season, maybe 24 of those titles are presented as being worthy of getting into the bookstore. At the next phase, usually after the sales rep leaves, is where the bookseller then considers these 24 titles. They perhaps look at how other books from the same authors performed, or how the mentioned comp titles performed in previous seasons. They might even look at a few of the other titles in the catalog that caught their eye, if they have the time, which is rare. Then, they have to weigh this fresh selection of titles that they think they should bring into the store against the 10 or more other sales pitch meetings and the various dozen other titles from each of those reps. Then they consider their budget, the shelf space available, and what they might need to return from existing stock to free up that budget or that shelf space. Then they place their purchase orders and bring in anywhere from 1 copy to perhaps as many as 5 to 10 copies of the titles from that specific sales pitch meeting, depending on how well the bookseller believes that the books are going to sell. And again, just a reminder that this is a slightly oversimplified look at the process and the decisions made along the way. So you can see that before a book even lands on a bookstore shelf, a significant amount of curation has happened, not to mention the investment of numerous parties who all ultimately believe this book is going to be successful. So, knowing that, back to my previously stated tracking in 2010, I realized that after all this vigorous curation by numerous individuals within the publishing industry trying to determine which titles would actually get placed onto the shelves in that store, 70% of those titles that me and the department buyers ordered and stocked ended up being returned 6 months later. 70%. That's right. Nearly 3/4 of the titles that made it onto the shelves in my store after all of that intense curation and analysis, all of that work, and yet only 30% of the titles brought in that season earned the store actual revenue. The rest contributed to costs of moving a bunch of dead trees in from the publisher onto store shelves, then back into boxes and returned to the publisher's warehouse. How could that be? Particularly after all that painstaking curation by so many talented and knowledgeable editors and sales representatives. One of the main reasons was that most of those titles came into the store in batches of 1 or 2 copies. When they were received, then they made it onto the shelves alongside the 40,000 other titles in the store, and they sat unnoticed, unbrowsed, undiscovered, until they gathered enough dust and needed to be returned to free up budget and space for the next season's titles. What are the books that sell then? I mean, besides the ones who are from big name authors or are on the various bestseller lists already, they are simply the books that are more well known. These are the books that are reviewed and talked about, the books that were asked about by customers coming into the store, the books that were recommended by the booksellers working in that store, the books that were discussed and debated, the books that ended up being included in some sort of feature or additional visibility display. Basically, they were the books that somehow came to the attention of either the bookseller or the customer, or both, rather than remaining one of those lonely spined titles that are easy to miss and walk by. The key, Or the most difficult task is getting awareness for your book so that the bookseller and or local readers are talking about, inquiring about your book. But it's also important to do it in a way that brings awareness without offering too much friction. And this is where having a personal relationship with a bookstore, a deep and meaningful relationship, rather than a superficial one, can be among your best assets. If you're already a regular at the bookstore in question, a consistent member of that bookstore's community, then you already have an easy in. I say relatively because if you write romance and the bookstore in question is a specialty science fiction and fantasy bookshop, well, then there's a missync between your books and the customers who patronize that store. But this is where, in natural conversation, a bookseller might become aware that you have a new book out and want to bring it into that store and perhaps even host a book event for you. Bookstores are a vital and vibrant part of the community. And if you're an active and visible part of that community, then it's more likely that you and your book will become more central to that bookstore's merchandising and marketing plans. But it's not always about getting special space on the shelves and in prominent displays. There's an intrinsic and more emotional connection that can occur when a bookseller is intimately familiar with you as an author and the content and themes within your book or books. Booksellers spend a lot of time talking about books with patrons in the store, particularly their regular customers and those avid readers who are always looking for new books and author recommendations. When a bookseller is familiar with what your book offers, it provides them an invaluable opportunity to help make that connection for a customer who is looking for their next great read. Yes, it's an organic thing that is never forced, but when it happens, it can be magic. That is more of a long-term connection that can ultimately bring you a lifelong reader fan. But it isn't something that's going to happen every day. Usually this is something that can occur weeks, months, or even years after the bookseller is endowed with the knowledge and understanding of what it is that your book might offer to a reader. One of the easiest ways for a bookseller to introduce an author's book is by identifying it to potential readers as a local author who happens to also be a patron of this bookshop. It's akin to a proud parent boasting about the achievements of their child. Of course, this proud parent moment can be from a local bookstore where you currently live, or it can be from a bookstore associated with your past, travels, or even work. Here are a few examples where that community connection can come into play. The community where you currently live. Your hometown, i.e. where you were born, raised, or brought up. A post-secondary education locale. The community where you work, particularly if you're commuting into work. Or a community that you regularly travel to and spend time in. And then again, any community where you've lived or where you have regularly traveled to over the years. All of those are different community connections. Any of these places are ones in which you might have that local author-style connection which can give you a special in. You might even be able to, in specific circumstances, forge a connection via close friends or family members. For example, let's say that your mother, who is an avid reader and book buyer, has wintered in a small community in Arizona between November and March for a dozen years. She gets to know the folks who run the local bookstore, and you, her daughter, has a new book that fits in with the types of books that she often discusses with them. This provides the perfect discussion piece that could lend itself to their desire to carry and talk about that book. In another example, let's consider that hometown bookstore. Several of my most successful book launches have been back in the area where I grew up. Well, not exactly. My hometown of Levack, Ontario, is a community of about 2,000 people that doesn't have a bookstore. But the city of Sudbury, with a population of about 90,000, and which is about an hour's drive southeast of Levack, does have several bookstores. And having moved away from there for post-secondary education and then my work career, I hadn't lived there in more than 16 years before they hosted my first major book launch in 2004. Not only did my hometown bookstore make a big deal about me and my new book, but the local newspapers, television, and radio stations also propped me up. That hometown author pride continues to serve me well, even more than 35 years after I no longer permanently lived in that community. In October of 2024, when I was re-releasing the 20th anniversary edition of One Hand Screaming, a collection of horror stories, the local news anchor for CTV Northern Ontario did a spotlight interview with me about my horror story collection and my career writing spooky and eerie tales. It seems that the entire community, and not just the bookstore, seemed to rally around the hometown author. So, even if the bookstore wasn't receptive to that local author nature, the fact that the town's media outlets were creating buzz for the author and the book usually led to the bookstore carrying or requesting those books. It's that hype and customer demand that can also serve to boost an author's sales. After all, if the bookstore knows that there are readers wanting to buy a specific title, they'll be more likely to endeavor to keep that book in stock. It is, of course, easier for the bookstore to be able to order the book which is available from a larger publisher, particularly one that has warehousing and distribution and allows for returns. But what happens if the bookstore has a policy, as most do, of not carrying titles that aren't listed in the wholesale catalog as returnable? That would be where local consignment options come into play. Consignment. Consignment is when the bookstore, consignee, and the publisher, author, consigner, sign an agreement where the consignee agrees to carry a specific number of titles in their stock directly procured from the consigner and make them available for purchase by their customers. The most common contract involves the payment for the sale of this product, minus the margin/percentage of the sale that is retained by the consignee. Despite the stock being in possession of the consignee, the consigner remains liable for, and technically in ownership of, the stock in question. This means that any shrinkage that happens, theft, misplacement, or damage, is the responsibility of the author/publisher and not the store. The terms bookstores request in a consignment agreement is usually 40% of the retail price. This means that if a book retails for $20, then 40% of that retail price, $8, is what the store keeps. Thus, they would pay $12 for every unit that sells. Terms of when the bookstore pays can vary. It can be monthly, quarterly, or annually, depending on their specific operation. A couple of bookstores I've worked with over the years wrote me a check right there on the spot for the books I dropped off, wanting to acquire them non-returnable. But again, this was with a bookseller where I had previously established a long-term relationship. And it was also a title that the bookseller knew they'd be able to sell and not be worried about returns. One of the biggest challenges of the consignment model is the manual labor, paperwork, and tracking of titles that it involves. It is definitely something that is difficult to scale, both for the bookstore and for the author/publisher. But, on the flip side, it does require an in-person relationship with the store and or booksellers in question, which can lead to discussions about events or other things which might involve sending people to that store to purchase that stock. We'll explore some of those ideas in the next subsection called What You Can Do for Your Bookstore. Well, that's it for the segment of that book that I was sharing. Again, this is from my manuscript, A Book in Hand, which is basically a lot about physical books and the importance of physical books in the world. So the rest of that chapter goes into, I talked about consignment already, I did that, and then what you can do for your bookstore. So we talk a little bit about some of the things to do, and then the next section is, then I get into the library side of things, because the entire chapter. I know I named this episode Bookstore, but I realized that this whole chapter then gets into libraries, and I explain how libraries work and the 3 A's of library strategies, what you can do for your library, and I go through some of those ideas as well as how to get to know your library and different kinds of libraries and just tips and stuff like that as well, and then things you can offer your library as well. And I give personal examples. So if you enjoyed this, let me know. What I can try to do is do an additional episode of the podcast where I get into the rest of that chapter, where I go on about details for libraries, etc. Because it goes on quite a little bit of for a bit of time, and I even talk about your books in the library and selling books in the library, and then I talk about, and this is the important factor, scaling your results, because as you probably felt when I was talking about bookstores, I'm talking about one-on-one relationships. Well, how do you scale that? And I talk about the way that you can scale that, leveraging maybe some of the networks you already have, and even the people on your newsletter and stuff can help you with some of those things. And then the next strategy is, or the next chapter, I should say, is strategies for approaching your bookstore or library. I mean, I've been working on this book for quite a while, and it is based on a lot of my own personal experiences and things that I know that worked. I'm not sure if you can hear in the background, but Atticus the cat is bringing a sock around the house, and he's whining as he does in his way as he's announcing this gift, this offering. He's going downstairs to bring it to Liz. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but I'm not going to cut it out if it's in the background. Normally when stuff like that happens, I'll just re-record, and what I should have done is I should have had the door closed, because there's no telling what the animals are going to... I can still hear him downstairs. He's so loud. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed this. My apologies. I have some great interviews in the queue that I'm looking forward to sharing with you, and I always feel like I need to apologize when I do a solo episode, because it feels like I'm cheating. It feels like I'm just like, well, I just turned on the mic and I did something, instead of going in and editing the interview and all of the extra. And it is hours of work to edit an interview properly and listen to it again and do the show notes and most importantly, as part of that process, isn't just cleaning it up and getting a good interview where I can clean up some of the audio and some of the ums and ahs that we make in the interview, but it's the reflection piece, and that takes a long time, and it's why I can't outsource that. It's so important to me that I'm the one who's listening and re-listening to this conversation and reflecting on what I'm thinking about and what I'm learning. It's sort of the promise I've made to you, the listener, and it's also a promise I made to myself in terms of this podcast. So when I do a solo episode, it tends to be because I don't need to do all of that extra additional work. I don't have the time. I'm running out of time. So it always feels like I'm cheating, but I suspect, and I hope that the solo episodes still give you that reflective value that's important for me to bring you. But that is it for this episode. And this week, of course, you had 2 episodes. We had episode 404, which I released on Wednesday, March 5th. And then we'll have this episode 405 released on March 7th. That's why if you do your math and you realize I've been doing this since January of 2018, I shouldn't yet be at 400 episodes. That's because every once in a while, because I would only be 52 episodes a year, and I can't do the math in my head, but 52 times 8 is whatever. Again, like I said, I can't do that in my head. No, it's 7 years I've been doing it, and I'm in season 8 now. My apologies, because 2025 subtract 2020, 2018. See, again, Mark, please, let's have a vow that Mark should never try to do math in his head on the podcast, because while he enjoys reflecting, he does not enjoy calculating. But anyways, with that aside over, that is it for this episode. I hope you did get value of it. A huge shout out and thank you not only to you, my awesome listeners, but to those who support this podcast over at patreon.com/Stark Reflections, who get access to additional bonus content, as well as my coffee buddies who support me at buymeacoffee.com/Mark Leslie. Again, thank you so much for listening. Until next week and until next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.